They call him the Black Wolf of Seoul. To the public, Kang Joon-hyuk is the billionaire CEO of the Haneul Group. To the underworld, he is the most feared mafia boss in South Korea. He carries a dark secret, a psychological condition that turns him into a violent monster the moment a woman touches his skin. Then there is Amiyah Sterling. A brilliant, broke American medical student who didn't come to Korea for romance, she came for justice. Her mother is facing a death sentence in a prison she doesn't belong in, and the price for her freedom is $2 million. It was a sum Amiyah could never earn, but it was a sum she could sell herself for. She thought it was a one-night deal. A transactional bargain with a dangerous stranger to buy her mother's life. She believed she could walk away and never look back. She was wrong. Amiyah didn't just sleep with the most dangerous man in Korea, she became the only person on earth who can keep him sane. Now, the Black Wolf isn't letting her go. He doesn't want a mistress, he wants a wife. And in his world? Till death do us part isn't a holy vow, it's a lethal warning. Welcome back to Plot Karma. Today we're diving into a story of high-stakes deception, medical mystery, and a love that crosses bloodlines. Amiyah is a fish out of water, trapped between her abusive Korean stepfamily, the Parks, and a political heiress, Lee Jong-di, who wants her dead. But what none of them realize is that Amiyah isn't just a nobody foreigner. While she uses her medical genius to treat Joon-hyuk's bipolar disorder and navigate the deadly politics of the Haneul Empire, a massive secret is about to explode. Across the ocean, one of the world's most powerful men is searching for a lost granddaughter. Will Amiyah survive the assassins long enough to claim her throne? Or will the Black Wolf's enemies tear them both apart first? The morning after the encounter at the nightclub, the air in Seoul felt different, heavier, charged with a secret that burned in the pit of Amiyah's stomach. She sat in a cramped clinic bathroom, staring at the thin blue lines on a plastic stick until her vision blurred. Pregnant. The word felt like a death sentence and a lifeline all at once. In a foreign country where she was already an outsider, she was now carrying the child of a man whose name she didn't even truly know. 6 weeks later, Amiyah stood on the stage of an international medical symposium at Seoul National University. She was there as a brilliant but overlooked research assistant, presenting her findings on neurochemical stabilizers. As she spoke, the heavy double doors at the back of the auditorium swung open. The room went silent. A phalanx of men in sharp, charcoal suits filed in, flanking a man who radiated a predatory grace. It was him. Kang Joon-hyuk, but he wasn't the shadowy figure from the club, he was the keynote speaker, the titan of Haneul. His eyes met hers across the crowded room, and for a second, the air left Amiyah's lungs. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a hunter who had finally located his prize. Your research on the amygdala is insightful, Miss Sterling. Park Joon-hyuk said during the Q&A, his voice a low, melodic vibration that sent shivers down her spine. He didn't ask a question, he made a claim. After the presentation, Amiyah hurried toward the exit, desperate to escape the weight of his gaze. She ducked into the rainy alleyway behind the university, her heart hammering. But she wasn't alone. A black sedan screeched to a halt, and 3 men, sent by her stepfather, Mr. Park, stepped out. Your mother's debt isn't fully paid, Amiyah, the lead man sneered, reaching for her arm. The assemblyman is tired of waiting for his bride. You're coming with us. Amiyah fought, her medical bag spilling onto the wet pavement, but they were too strong. Just as they tried to shove her into the car, a sickening thud echoed through the alley. One of the kidnappers was slammed against the brick wall with such force the bone cracked. Joon-hyuk stood there, his coat discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. His eyes were dark, almost manic, the telltale sign of the storm rising within him. He moved like a blur, a terrifying display of controlled violence that left the 3 men unconscious in seconds. He turned to Amiyah, his chest heaving, his hands trembling. This was the condition she had heard whispered about, the bipolar-induced rage triggered by proximity. But as he stepped toward her, the expected explosion didn't happen. Instead, as Amiyah reached out instinctively to steady him, placing her hand on his chest, his breathing slowed. The tremors stopped. You ___, he whispered, his voice thick with wonder. The storm, it stops when I'm near you. You're hurt, she breathed, looking at his bloodied knuckles. I'm a monster, Amiyah. A man who runs an empire built on shadows, he said, pinning her against the wall, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. And you are carrying my heir. I know about the child. I know about the parks. I know everything. The realization hit her like a physical blow. He hadn't found her by accident. I won't let them take you, he continued, his face inches from hers, but I cannot protect a stranger. If you stay in the streets, you die. If you come with me, you become the most powerful woman in this city. Marry me, Amiyah. Help me control this darkness, and I will give you the world. I will give you your mother. Amiyah looked into the eyes of the Black Wolf of Seoul. She saw the danger, the power, and a strange, aching loneliness that mirrored her own. She had come to Korea to save her mother, but to do it, she would have to dive headfirst into the mouth of the beast. On one condition, she said, her voice steadying. My mother is released. Today. Joon-hyuk pulled a phone from his pocket, never taking his eyes off her. Done. That night, in a private, high-security wing of the Haneul estate, a secret ceremony took place. There were no flowers, no guests, only Joon-hyuk's grandfather, a man with eyes like flint who watched Amiyah with calculating intensity. He saw how his grandson's aura settled the moment he took Amiyah's hand. As the papers were signed, Amiyah Sterling was walked out of the prison gates and into a waiting limousine. Amiyah was now a wife, a future mother, and a member of the most dangerous family in Asia. But as she looked at the gold band on her finger, she knew the real war had only just begun. The underworld did not forgive weakness, and her presence was the biggest target Joon-hyuk had ever worn. The transition from medical student to the wife of Haneul Group's CEO felt less like a fairy tale and more like a tactical deployment. Amiyah was moved into the Haneul penthouse, a glass and steel fortress overlooking a city that didn't know she existed. But Amiyah wasn't content to be a bird in a gilded cage. By day, she donned a lab coat, taking a senior position at Haneul's pharmaceutical research division. It was the only way to stay close to the man who was now her husband, and the only way to save him. Joon-hyuk's condition was a volatile secret, a ticking time bomb that threatened to shatter his corporate legitimacy and his grip on the underground syndicate. Amiyah spent her nights poring over his medical records and her days in the lab, feverishly developing an experimental neurostabilizer tailored to his specific DNA. She wasn't just his wife, she was becoming his cure. You're working too hard. Joon-hyuk murmured one evening, stepping into her home laboratory. The air in the room shifted instantly. The tension that usually radiated from him like heat seemed to melt in her presence. He pulled her away from the microscope, his hands resting on her waist. The board is already whispering about the American girl in the research wing. They don't realize you're the one keeping their chairman from burning the building down. Amiyah leaned into him, the scent of expensive sandalwood and rain grounding her. Let them whisper. As long as the treatment works, they can think whatever they want. But the whispers soon turned into a roar. The following morning, the glass doors of the Haneul lobby swung open to admit a storm of a different kind. Lee Jeon-di, the daughter of Korea's most powerful political family, marched in with a phalanx of photographers trailing behind her. She was the woman the public expected Joon-hyuk to marry, a pure-blood heiress with a smile as sharp as a razor. Within hours, the news cycle was flooded. The Black Wolf's secret paramour? The headlines screamed, accompanied by grainy photos of Amiyah entering the Haneul estate. Jeon-di didn't stop there. She sat for a televised interview, her eyes brimming with calculated tears. My engagement to Chairman Kang remains the pillar of our family's alliance, she told the cameras. This foreign woman is a temporary distraction, a research assistant who has overstepped her bounds. She doesn't understand our traditions, our blood, or our future. The xenophobic backlash was instantaneous. Social media exploded with calls for Amiyah's removal, labeling her a gold digger and a foreign virus infecting the Haneul legacy. In the high-security research wing, Amiyah watched the feed, her hands trembling. She felt the walls of Seoul closing in. But then, a firm hand covered hers. Joon-hyuk stood behind her, his eyes glowing with a cold, terrifying fury directed at the screen. "She's declaring war," Amiyah whispered. "She's declaring her own funeral," Joon-hyuk countered, his voice a low growl. The pressure culminated that night when Joon-hyuk suffered his most violent episode yet. A high-stress syndicate meeting had gone south, and by the time he reached the penthouse, he was breaking furniture, his mind lost in a bipolar storm of rage. The guards hovered at the door, terrified to enter. Amiyah didn't hesitate. She stepped into the wreckage, holding the first vial of her experimental stabilizer. Joon-hyuk lunged, his hand catching her throat for a split second before his eyes cleared and he saw who she was. The horror on his face was agonizing. "Amiyah, get out," he roared, fighting himself. "No," she said, her voice a calm, steady anchor. She pressed the needle into his arm, injecting the serum. Slowly, the tension drained from his muscles. He collapsed to his knees, burying his face in her lap, gasping for air as the storm finally went silent. In that moment of vulnerability, the bond between them solidified into something unbreakable. Amiyah realized that John D wasn't just a romantic rival, she was a threat to Joon-hyuk's sanity and survival. To protect her husband and her unborn child, Amiyah would have to step out of the shadows and prove that she wasn't just a mistress or a doctor. She was the new queen of the Haneul Empire. The victory in the lab was short-lived as the ghosts of Amiyah's past surged forward to collect their pound of flesh. While John D attacked her reputation in the press, the Park family, the aunt and uncle who had treated Amiyah like a servant and framed her mother, decided to strike at her physically. Driven by the fear that Amiyah's new position would expose their crimes, they waited for a moment of perceived weakness. It happened during a rare afternoon when Amiyah ventured to the Haneul-funded medical clinic to oversee her mother's recovery. As she stepped out into the private parking garage, a van screeched to a halt, blocking her path. Her uncle, Mr. Park, stepped out, his face twisted with a mixture of greed and desperation. "You think you're a queen now?" he spat, lunging for her. "You're a thief. You stole the money that was supposed to secure our family's future. If you don't give us the access codes to the Haneul accounts, your mother won't live to see the sunset." But Amiyah was no longer the frightened girl who had arrived in Seoul with nothing. She stood her ground, her hand resting protectively over her stomach. "You framed my mother for embezzlement to cover your own gambling debts," she said, her voice like ice. "I have the medical records, and I have the eyes of the Black Wolf watching every move you make." The mention of Joon-hyuk sent a flicker of terror through Mr. Park, but desperation won out. He raised his hand to strike her, but he never made contact. A shadow materialized from the darkness of the garage. Joon-hyuk didn't use a gun, he used his hands with a surgical, terrifying precision. In a matter of seconds, the Park family's hired thugs were on the ground, and Mr. Park was pinned against the concrete wall, Joon-hyuk's fingers tightening around his throat. "You touch what is mine," Joon-hyuk whispered, the cold storm in his eyes more dangerous than any bipolar episode. "In my world, that is a debt paid in blood." "Joon-hyuk, stop," Amiyah commanded, her voice the only thing that could reach him in that state. "Don't kill him. I need him alive to talk." Joon-hyuk dropped the man like a piece of trash. Within an hour, the Haneul Group's legal and tactical teams had moved with a ferocity that stunned the city. By nightfall, the Park family's business empire was systematically dismantled, contracts cancelled, bank accounts frozen, and evidence of their decades-long corruption leaked to the highest levels of the prosecution. While the Parks were being erased from Seoul's elite society, Amiyah was in the Haneul archives, sifting through the files her team had seized from her uncle's office. Her eyes scanned a faded document, a birth certificate for her mother, Lana, that didn't list a Korean father. Instead, it was tucked inside a high-security envelope embossed with a crest she recognized from her medical textbooks on global philanthropy, the Sterling crest. Amiyah's breath hitched. The Parks hadn't just framed her mother for money, they had been hiding her true identity. Lana wasn't just a disgraced immigrant, she was the missing daughter of Arthur Sterling, a man whose wealth made the Haneul Group look like a local startup. The Parks had intercepted the search decades ago, keeping Lana in poverty to ensure she could never claim her inheritance. Amiyah looked at the gold band on her finger and then at the Sterling crest. She had married a mafia boss to save a nobody, only to realize she was the granddaughter of a king. They didn't just steal our lives, Joon-hyuk, Amiyah said as he entered the room, his presence a warm weight against the chill of the revelation. They stole a dynasty. Joon-hyuk looked at the documents, a dark smile playing on his lips. Then we won't just take it back. We'll burn down anyone who stands in the way of your throne. Amiyah felt the shift in her own soul. The girl who had bartered her body for $2 million was dead. In her place was a woman who now held the keys to 2 empires, and she was ready to use every bit of her power to ensure the Lee family and the Parks suffered for every tear her mother had ever shed. The war for the Haneul throne shifted from the streets to the inner sanctum of the Kang family estate. While Joon-hyuk's power came from fear and capital, the true gatekeeper of the empire was his grandfather Kang, a man whose neurological health was failing as rapidly as his patience for outsiders. The family's traditional doctors had already written the patriarch off, diagnosing a series of small strokes that had left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak. The consensus among the board was to ship him to a facility in Switzerland, a move that would allow Joon-hyuk's rival cousin to seize control of the succession. They are giving up on him because it's convenient, Amiyah said, standing at the foot of the old man's bed. The room smelled of antiseptic and incense. Joon-hyuk stood behind her, his hand resting on the small of her back. The doctors say there's no hope, Amiyah. If he dies now, the Lee family will use the chaos to void our marriage and force me into an alliance with John D. Amiyah didn't answer. She was looking at the way the patriarch's eyes tracked a fly across the ceiling. She noticed the slight tremors in his left hand, not the chaotic shaking of a stroke victim, but a rhythmic, specific twitch. She pulled out her penlight, checking his pupil dilation, then gently pressed her fingers into the lymph nodes beneath his jaw. He didn't have a stroke, she whispered, her medical intuition firing. He has an ultra-rare neurological inflammation, an autoimmune mimic. Every treatment they've given him for strokes has actually been making his brain swell further. Despite the protests of the Kang family's traditional physicians, who dismissed her as a Western girl playing doctor, Amiyah took charge. She spent 48 hours straight in the Haneul lab, synthesizing a high-potency corticosteroid cocktail designed to cross the blood-brain barrier. As she administered the first dose, the room was thick with tension. John D. stood by the door, watching with a predatory smirk. If he dies under your care, Amiyah, it won't just be a scandal. It will be murder. Amiyah ignored her. She watched the monitors. For 3 hours, nothing happened. Then, the patriarch's fingers twitched. His eyes, previously clouded, suddenly cleared. He took a gasping breath and looked directly at Amiyah. Water, he croaked in a voice that hadn't been heard in months. The room went silent. Joon-hyuk dropped to his knees by his grandfather's side, but the old man's gaze remained fixed on Amiyah. He reached out with a trembling hand, not for his grandson, but for her. A week later, a formal tea ceremony was convened. Grandfather Kang, seated in a traditional chair and looking stronger than he had in years, beckoned Amiyah forward. The entire Kang clan, including the humiliated John D., watched in stunned silence. A doctor heals the body, the patriarch said, his voice raspy but commanding. But a wife who fights the world to save her family, she heals the bloodline. He reached into a silk-lined box and pulled out a heavy, translucent jade heirloom, a necklace that had belonged to his late wife, the founding matriarch of Haneul. He placed it around Amiyah's neck. In the rigid hierarchy of Korean high society, this wasn't just a gift. It was a formal adoption into the bloodline. It was a declaration that Amiyah was untouchable. As the ceremony concluded, Amiyah caught John D's eye. The heiress's face was a mask of cold, vibrating rage. Amiyah realized that by earning the grandfather's favor, she hadn't ended the war, she had just ensured that the next strike from the Lee family would be lethal. But as she felt the cool weight of the jade against her skin and the strength of Joon-hyuk's hand in hers, she knew she was ready. She was no longer just protecting herself, she was the architect of a new dynasty. The victory at the family estate sent shockwaves through the Haneul Group's corporate headquarters. Amiyah was no longer seen as a mere distraction, she was a threat to the established order. She moved her base of operations to the heart of Haneul's pharmaceutical division, working to finalize the drug that would stabilize Joon-hyuk's condition forever. But the corporate world was just as treacherous as the underworld. During a critical phase of the drug's formulation, the laboratory's main server was hit by a sophisticated logic bomb. Someone had introduced a subtle error into the chemical ratios, a change so small it would have gone unnoticed until the drug was mass-produced, potentially causing a global medical catastrophe that would have bankrupted the Haneul Group. Amiyah spent 36 hours straight in the clean room, her eyes burning as she manually cross-referenced thousands of data points against her original handwritten notes. She found the discrepancy in a single line of code. They didn't just try to steal the formula, she told Joon-hyuk as he watched her work from the glass observation deck. They tried to turn your greatest breakthrough into a weapon that would destroy your reputation. With a few keystrokes, she isolated the breach, tracing it back to a shell company linked to the Lee political family. Not only did she save the company billions, but she also secured the patent that would make Haneul the undisputed leader in global neuromedicine. John D., seeing her political leverage and corporate sabotage fail, turned to more intimate, primitive methods. Under the guise of a reconciliation luncheon hosted by the Haneul Women's Committee, John D. invited Amiyah to a private tea. "You've proven yourself quite capable, Amiyah," John D. said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness as she poured from a delicate porcelain pot. "But a crown is heavy for someone who wasn't born to wear it. You look tired. Perhaps some traditional herbal tea will help with the pregnancy." Amiyah watched the steam rise from the cup. As a medical student, her senses were heightened to the faint, metallic scent of digitalis, a potent heart stimulant that, in high doses, could mimic a natural miscarriage or a cardiac event. She didn't drink. Instead, she set the cup down and looked John D. directly in the eye. "My mother always told me that the most beautiful flowers are often the most toxic, John D. It's a shame you didn't realize I spent my life studying the very poisons you use as parlor tricks." Amiyah stood up, her coldness mirroring Joon-hyuk's. "If you ever come near my food, my lab, or my child again, I won't just expose you. I will use my medical knowledge to ensure you spend the rest of your life in a ward you can't escape." John D's mask finally cracked, her face contorting into a snarl of pure hatred. But before she could speak, the doors opened. Joon-hyuk entered, followed by his security detail. He didn't look at John D., his eyes were fixed on the teacup. "Take it, Joon-hyuk," commanded his head of security. "Have the lab analyze every drop." He then turned to John D., his voice a low, terrifying whisper. "You are banned from every Haneul property. If I see your face again before the gala, I will consider it a declaration of war against my house." As they walked out, Joon-hyuk pulled Amiyah close, his hand trembling with a mix of fear and rage. "You're in more danger than I realized," he admitted. "The rival syndicates see my devotion to you as a weakness they can exploit. They think if they kill you, they kill the Black Wolf." "They're wrong," Amiyah said, her resolve hardening. "If they kill me, they release the monster. And I think it's time we let them know exactly what happens when you threaten a Sterling." The lines were drawn. The corporate sabotage had failed, the poisoning had been thwarted, and the grandfather had given his blessing. There was only one thing left: the 60th anniversary gala, where Joon-hyuk intended to announce their marriage to the world, and where John D. was planning her final, desperate strike. The 60th anniversary gala of the Haneul Group was not merely a party, it was a coronation ceremony for the most powerful dynasty in Korea. The grand ballroom of the Shilla Hotel was a sea of black ties, silk gowns, and the sharp, predatory scent of old money. Every influential figure in the country was present, from cabinet ministers to the heads of rival syndicates masquerading as legitimate businessmen. For Amiyah, the preparation felt like arming for battle. She stood before a floor-to-ceiling mirror in the penthouse, draped in a gown of deep midnight blue that shimmered like a bruised sky. Around her neck, the jade heirloom from grandfather Kang pulsed with a green light that felt like a shield. "You look like a queen," Joon-hyuk whispered, appearing behind her. He wore a tuxedo that accentuated his broad shoulders, but his eyes were restless. The storm was quiet, thanks to the medication Amiyah had perfected, but the tension of the impending revelation weighed on him. "Tonight, there is no turning back. Once I announce you as my wife, every enemy I have becomes yours. I stopped being afraid of your enemies the moment I realized they were mine, too," Amiyah replied, turning to face him. She adjusted his tie, her touch instantly grounding him. "Let's give them something to talk about." As they arrived at the gala, the atmosphere turned electric. The sea of elite guests parted like the Red Sea. Whispers followed them like a physical wake, the foreigner, the doctor, the mistress, Amiyah ignored them all, walking with a poise that suggested she had been born to walk these halls. However, the peace was shattered when the Lee family made their entrance. Jeon-di appeared at her father's side, the powerful Minister Lee. She wasn't dressed like a guest, she was dressed like a bride in a shimmering white gown, a direct and public insult to Amiyah's presence. "Chairman Kang," Minister Lee boomed, his voice carrying across the ballroom. "It is a grand night. Especially since we have the formal merger of our families to celebrate. My daughter has waited long enough for the official announcement of your engagement." A hush fell over the room. This was a public ambush. If Joon-hyuk denied it now, he would be declaring war on the political machinery of the country. If he accepted it, he would be publicly delegitimizing Amiyah. Jeon-di stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with a triumph that was premature. "Joon-hyuk," she said softly, reaching for his hand. "Don't let this temporary arrangement embarrass our families any further." Joon-hyuk didn't move. He didn't take her hand. Instead, he stepped toward the microphone at the head of the ballroom, his voice echoing with the cold authority of the Black Wolf. "Minister Lee, I believe there has been a grave misunderstanding," Joon-hyuk stated, his gaze sweeping the room. "The Haneul Group does not merge based on ancient contracts that were never signed. We merge based on loyalty and blood." He reached back, taking Amiyah's hand and pulling her to his side. "This is not my research assistant. This is not a guest. This is Amiyah Sterling Park, my wife, and the future mother of the Haneul heir. Anyone who disrespects her, disrespects me. And anyone who threatens her, threatens the entire Haneul Empire." The shock in the room was palpable. It was a scandal that would dominate the headlines for months. But in the back of the room, near the shadows of the velvet curtains, a tall, silver-haired man watched the scene with a different kind of intensity. He wasn't looking at Joon-hyuk. He was staring at Amiyah, his hand trembling as he gripped a crystal glass. Arthur Sterling had spent 40 years looking for a ghost. He had followed a lead to Seoul, expecting to find another dead end. Instead, he saw a woman standing on a stage who looked exactly like the daughter he had lost, right down to the defiant tilt of her chin and the shape of her eyes. "Sir," his assistant whispered. "The car is ready." "Cancel it," Arthur Sterling commanded, his voice thick with emotion. "I found her. I finally found her." The gala was no longer just a corporate event, it was the epicenter of a collision between two global empires. As the Lee family retreated in disgrace, Jeon-di caught Amiyah's eye one last time. There was no rage left, only a cold, hollow vacuum. Amiyah knew the final strike was coming, not a scandal or a poisoning, but an ending. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind of international scandal and private tension. While the Korean press scrambled to identify the American Cinderella, a much more dangerous game was being played behind the scenes. Arthur Sterling, the man whose name was synonymous with global shipping and steel, had not stayed in the shadows for long. The following afternoon, at an exclusive international charity auction, the tension reached a breaking point. Amiyah sat beside Joon-hyuk in the front row, the target on her back now glowing brighter than ever. Across the aisle, John-D sat with her father, her face a frozen mask of porcelain. She had lost her reputation, her engagement, and her pride. She had nothing left but the dark alliances she had made with Joon-hyuk's rival syndicates. Before the first gavel could fall, the heavy oak doors of the hall were thrown open. Arthur Sterling walked in, flanked by a security detail that rivaled Joon-hyuk's own. He didn't look at the stage or the auctioneer. He walked straight to Amiyah. "My name is Arthur Sterling," he said, his voice cracking with a vulnerability that stunned the room. He held out a folder, the results of a lightning-fast DNA comparison from a hair sample his team had retrieved from the gala. "And I believe I am looking at my granddaughter." The room erupted in whispers. The foreign nobody was suddenly the scion of a dynasty that could buy and sell the Haneul Group 10 times over. Joon-hyuk stood, his hand instinctively moving to the small of Amiyah's back, his protective instincts warring with the shock of the revelation. But the moment of reunion was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. "If she's a queen, then she can die like one." John-D's voice shrieked from the balcony above. It was a coordinated strike. John-D hadn't just brought her father's influence, she had brought the rival syndicate's elite assassins. Red laser dots danced across the floor, and the room descended into chaos as gunmen emerged from the service entrances. John-D, driven to a psychotic break, held a small, silver pistol aimed directly at Amiyah's abdomen. "You took everything from me." John-D screamed over the panic. "My legacy, my man, my future." She pulled the trigger. Time seemed to slow. Joon-hyuk lunged to shield Amiyah, his storm erupting in a surge of protective adrenaline. But it was Arthur Sterling's lead security officer who reacted with professional finality, throwing a ballistic shield in the line of fire just as the bullet struck. Simultaneously, Joon-hyuk's men engaged the syndicate assassins in a brutal, close-quarters firefight that turned the luxury hall into a war zone. Amidst the gunfire, Joon-hyuk moved like a blur of lethal precision, disarming 2 attackers before they could reach the front row. He was no longer a CEO, he was the Black Wolf, and he was hunting. John-D was tackled to the ground by Arthur's team before she could fire a second shot. As the smoke cleared and the rival gunmen were neutralized or fled, the silence that followed was heavy with the scent of cordite and expensive perfume. Amiyah stood in the center of the wreckage, her hands trembling but her head held high. She looked at Arthur Sterling, then at Joon-hyuk, who was covered in the dust of the skirmish but eyes only for her. "Is it true?" she whispered to Arthur, looking at the DNA report that had fallen to the floor. "Your mother, Lana, she was my only child." "I thought she was lost in that accident 40 years ago," Arthur said, tears streaming down his face. "I've spent my life building a throne with no one to sit on it. Until now." Joon-hyuk stepped forward, his eyes softening as he saw Amiyah was safe. He turned to the remaining elite guests and the cameras that were still rolling. He took Amiyah's hand, the Sterling heir and the Haneul wife. "The war is over," Joon-hyuk declared, his voice carrying the weight of a final judgment. "And the Lee family has just signed their own death warrant." The aftermath of the auction was a legal and literal execution of the old guard. Within 48 hours, the Lee political dynasty collapsed under the weight of conspiracy to commit murder and international arms trafficking charges. John-D, stripped of her titles and her sanity, was moved from a jail cell to a high-security psychiatric ward, the very fate she had once plotted for Amiyah. The Park family, too, found no mercy. With the combined legal might of the Sterling and Haneul empires, they were prosecuted to the fullest extent for the kidnapping of Lana Sterling and the decades-long fraud that had nearly buried the truth. Justice, however, was only half the victory. The true triumph was found in a sun-drenched garden at the Sterling estate, where Amiyah watched her mother, Lana, take her first steps of freedom. Lana was no longer a prisoner of a system that had failed her, she was a woman restored to her father and her dignity. Joon-hyuk. approached Amiyah as she watched them from the terrace. The air between them was different now. The storm that had once threatened to consume his mind had been silenced, not just by Amiyah's medicine, but by the peace of their union. He didn't come to her as a boss or a billionaire, but as a man who had finally found home. The board of Haneul and the Sterling trustees have finalized the merger, Joon-hyuk said, standing beside her. We are now the largest conglomerate in the world. But that isn't why I'm here. He dropped to one knee, not for the cameras or a political alliance, but for her. He pulled out a box containing a ring that was a masterpiece of design, a flawless American diamond centered within a band of traditional Korean jade, symbolizing two worlds becoming one. Amiyah, you didn't just save my life with your science, you saved my soul with your love. I don't want to just be your husband in secret. I want to build a world where our child never has to hide who they are. Will you marry me again, this time, before the whole world? Yes, Amiyah whispered, her voice thick with emotion. 1,000 times, yes. The final scene of their journey took place months later. A public wedding that stopped the heart of Seoul, a celebration of a love that had survived the darkest corners of the underworld and the highest peaks of corporate greed. As they stood on the balcony of their new home, looking out over the city where they had met under such desperate circumstances, Amiyah felt the flutter of new life within her. They were no longer just a doctor and a mafia boss, they were the architects of a new era. The American medical student who had bartered her night for her mother's life had gained an empire, a grandfather, and a love that was stronger than blood. Meeting you was fate, Joon-hyuk said, pulling her into his arms as the sun set over the Han River. Loving you was my choice, Amiyah replied. And staying with you? That's my forever.